Welcome to the Alcove. I'm Mark Malero. My guest today is David Grewal. He is currently a PhD candidate in the field of political theory at Harvard University. His well-received first book is entitled Network Power: The Social Dynamics of Globalization. He's here to discuss it with us today. David Grewal, welcome.
Thank you.
It's interesting because you say in your book that for all the attention that globalization has gotten, we still don't really have any consensus on how best to understand it. I'm wondering if you can give us a bit of a sense of what you mean by that.
Well, since any contemporary phenomenon of importance crosses some kind of border, I think the term globalization has become something of a catch-all. Everything gets lumped in there. It's not just the case in academia where it's globalization and whatever that's the hot topic, but even in the popular press. Globalization seems to be on everybody's lips, and yet when you get down and push at the analytics of what we're talking about, they become very unclear. There's a lot of different terms being thrown around, a lot of different concepts, and they're all being lumped together under this idea of globalization. The word itself is interesting because it's a relatively recent coinage. It only goes back in its current usage to about the 1960s. And I think that should tell us something, that it's a complicated new term, that actually a lot of older concepts are now being grouped together under. In fact, the related word international only goes back as far as the late 18th century. It was coined by Jeremy Bentham. So a lot of these words are of relatively recent provenance, and globalization especially.
I'm curious if you could maybe just give us maybe a simple definition of what exactly network power is.
So in my book, I try and argue that globalization can best be understood by reference to this idea I put forward called network power. And the idea of network power joins two ideas. The first is that coordinating standards, and maybe we can get to talking about what those are, that coordinating standards grow in value the more they're used by other people. So take a language. It's more valuable for people to learn to speak English now than many other languages, simply because so many people already do speak English. So that's the first idea. The second idea is that as one standard gains in prominence and becomes dominant, it can have the effect of edging out alternative standards, so that one way of doing something becomes the rule of the game, so to speak. And these two ideas I think of together as network power: the pull of a dominant standard drawing people into a dominant network, but also the exclusion of alternative ways of doing the same thing.
And you've said that the standards that gain the most precedence become focal points for global coordination. What do you mean by that exactly?
So the idea of focal point comes from the work of an economist named Thomas Schelling, who won the Nobel Prize and is famous for a lot of his work, especially in the 1960s. And the idea of a focal point is actually pretty interesting, and it's at the heart of the idea I put forward here. The example that Schelling used was the problem of meeting up with a lost friend in the middle of Manhattan without having specified any way to coordinate in advance. And what he found when talking to people was that everyone said, well, I would go to the information booth beneath the clock tower in the middle of Grand Central Station, and I would wait there. And they said this without having consulted with each other. They all just said that independently. And then he said, well, what time? And an absolute majority of the people he talked to said, well, at 12 noon. So Schelling used this and similar examples to illustrate what he calls focal points, which are points or conventions or ways of doing things on my more expansive reading of his idea that allow us to coordinate our actions even without express prior agreement. So we don't have to all have agreed beforehand, we will meet at Grand Central, but somehow we know that we will.
You say we're deciding on these standards in terms of how to facilitate a lot of our global activities, how to coordinate them. We're perhaps not asking what as much as how. Is there a certain arbitrariness to these standards? Also, there's a power relationship as well.
Absolutely. So I take this example of meeting up with a lost friend, which is an example of sort of physical coordination. And I argue that what globalization introduces is a game of social coordination. Not where am I going to meet my lost friend, but how am I going to meet up with lots of other people who I'd like to do things with, to trade ideas, goods, and so on, but whom I don't yet know, and I don't yet know how I would meet them. And the way that we do that are via coordinating standards, languages, laws, frames of reference, that become focal points driving globalization forward. Now, at the level of simple description, I think that's how we can best account for a lot of what's going on in globalization. The problem is, I think there's also a power involved in that very dynamic.
And it's also interesting because you say the standards are double-edged, Janus-faced, if you will, that we're free, but in some sense we're also not free. How is it that these standards benefit us, but in terms of the way that the power structures are, that they're somewhat arbitrary, that we have in some ways new choices, but a lot of our choices are limited, especially localized choices?
Right, exactly. So the book was motivated by a puzzle in some ways, precisely on this point, which is how best to characterize globalization. On the one hand, you have people who claim that it represents an unambiguous advance in freedom, new opportunities for individuals to roam the globe with their money and their ideas, their ambitions, outside national regulatory regimes. On the other hand, you'll get people saying that globalization represents a new kind of empire, or that it's constraining, that it represents an exercise in power. And what's interesting about these two different views is that they're not talking about different aspects of globalization. They often will attach to the very same act. So the choice of somebody to learn English overseas, or the choice of a nation to accede to the World Trade Organization, are, on the face of it, reasoned, freely made choices. And yet you'll get people saying they manifest freedom or they manifest unfreedom, the very same action. So with the idea of network power, I think we can make sense of this otherwise puzzling combination of voluntary, even eager acceptance of globalization and the profound resentment that seems to accompany it. And the reason is that the choice to join a dominant standard is a choice which is voluntarily made, but may be made only against the backdrop of limited options. So that as one way of doing something becomes the dominant rule of the game, it is true that we have an open world and people can join that game, but they can only do so often by connecting up and by cooperating according to conventions that are already established and over which they may not have had any say in the first place.
Do you also find it, are you somewhat frustrated by the often kind of superficial and maybe even ideological debates that seem to, as you say, there's the two sides with globalization, things get reduced that way? And the sense that I got in the book is that you want to take a step back and maybe get away from any partisanship. You want to study it as a phenomenon.
Right. So to go back to this globalization as, to take Thomas Friedman's term, the world is flat. So globalization is a flat world versus globalization as empire. I think that if we reject both of these extremes, if we think of globalization as a networked world, we can begin to get a bit more purchase on what's going on. And specifically in the following sense, if the world were flat, it wouldn't matter very much which standards we use to connect and collaborate. But actually it matters very much because some people's conventions become established as the globally dominant ones, while others get left aside. And so I think some of the resentment that we see issuing in declarations of empire can best be understood in that way, while at the same time we can understand the idea of the world being flat on this very same grounds, which is that networks are often open structures. You're free to join them, but you have to join them by doing things the way that things are already done. So I think that with that kind of a model, we can make sense actually of both of these otherwise opposed views. I think they're actually two sides of the same coin.
And you've also talked about how America is in a particularly prominent place in terms of benefiting from globalization. Do you think that that's something that's going to continue? I mean, certainly America is facing a lot of crises at the moment, but do you think that America's dominance will continue in terms of often being in a particular power place to set a lot of these standards?
Well, that's something that's interesting and I've been thinking about recently, which is there's a lot of discussion about America's decline. And at the level of hard power, say the ability to project military force, it seems clear we're bogged down in wars that a decade ago we wouldn't have thought that we would be in, and they've revealed weaknesses we didn't know were there. Same is true of a lot of American soft power. We're regarded very poorly overseas. Obama may change that, but for the moment, American soft power has maybe never been lower. The interesting thing here is to think about the network power of American standards, because it's my suspicion that independent of either the hard or soft power of the United States, the network power of the United States will continue, perhaps persist long after the United States has ceased to be a world power, if we can project far into the future. And there are historical precedents for this. If you think about the Hellenization of much of the Middle East, even long after Alexander's conquests ceased, or the continued Romanization of Western Europe, even after Rome had fallen apart, its language and its laws continue on and become influential in ways that no original Roman might have thought. The same thing may be very well true of this American-led globalization, which is that it may not at some point any longer be dependent on America as a national power for it to be the case that the world is in certain respects Americanizing. I'll give an example of this. I spoke recently at a network of alumni of the Indian Institute of Technology. And I asked them sort of some questions about what language they spoke with each other and at home and when they went abroad, and of course it was all English. And then I asked them, so did you learn English in order to come to the United States and to be able to talk to Americans? No. And if the United States were to disappear beneath the waves tomorrow, creating a vast channel linking up the Atlantic and the Pacific, if we can imagine such a doomsday scenario, would you stop speaking English? No. And if you were to go to China to do business, what language would you assume that you were going to speak with your Chinese counterparts? English.
Wow, so the paradigm is really
set.
The
paradigm is set. So in some ways, it may be that English was, well, it was the case that English was very dependent on both British and American power at certain stages in its ascendance. But one of the things I think that we see when we think about network power carefully is that at the early stages, a standard may be dependent on other forms of power. But beyond a certain threshold, I think network power grows of itself and may in fact implicate people in a new relation of power quite independent of the old forms of power on which it was once reliant.
Does network power change the way that we should be looking at international agencies and the need for perhaps even a post-nationalist paradigm of the way that globalization works, even though America and that paradigm is very much set in a certain regard? If you are thinking about network power, does it put pressure on current international agencies and maybe perhaps even spark the idea of new ones that we need right now?
That's interesting. I mean, broadly, one of the concerns I bring in the book is that I try to bring out in the book is how best to counter network power where we find it objectionable. And I keep returning again and again to the idea that actually organized politics, organized democratic politics, which is for the moment only operative at the national level, is really the only effective countervailing force we have against network power. So I'm actually somewhat skeptical or maybe even suspicious of too quick a desire for there to be a post-national form of global governance. There's been a lot of interest in global governance circles about transnational networks as forms of governance, and I think that as supplements to the usual regulatory power of nation states, they're obviously an important form of governance, but as substitutes for the ordinary kinds of politics that democratic citizens engage in, I think that the move to networks would be disastrous. It would undermine the forms of legitimacy and the forms of collective action that we take for granted in democratic politics.
Does the current global economic crisis change your thinking, or is that a challenge perhaps to maybe even some of your paradigms? Because it's such a shock this year, all of the events that have happened. How has that sort of changed things since you've published this book and the way that you look at
actually, I mean,
globalization?
funny you should bring that up. I'm very, very glad that the book came out in May.
Okay.
Because it has some pessimistic projections about neoliberal globalization. It was much better for me that those should come out before the financial crisis hit than after, because I think we're going to now see a spate of books predicting the problems with, discussing the problems with globalization. And I was lucky that I snuck my book in just before that. Of course, as you know, any book is long in germination, and it took me something like 6 years to produce this. And throughout, I've been concerned about the way in which neoliberal globalization has been developing. I'm not alone in that, obviously, but a lot of the voices that formerly were more marginalized on this issue are now on the op-ed pages, and I'm glad to see that shift.
It's part of the dialogue.
It's part of the dialogue, absolutely.
I was wondering if we could take a few cases of network power. You mentioned the World Trade Organization.
Right.
You also talk about some cultural globalization, things like the dystopic McWorld and things like that.
Right.
But the WTO specifically, how do you view that organization in this present context?
The World Trade Organization is an interesting example and a complicated one. Specifically, I think we can think of the set of trade agreements that it embodies as constituting a complex standard. And like any standard, the question is, who wants access to whom, and by what means do they get it? And so if countries, for example, in the developing world, want access to foreign markets for their goods, for their trade and goods, and they need to accept the World Trade Organization agreements to get those, it may be that the World Trade Organization is progressing because of network power reasons, or at least the huge wave of countries joining it was because of network power, as much as for any intrinsic benefits that these countries thought that the free trade regime would give them. I think that the recent failure of the Doha round, so the failure to finalize any new and additional agreements to sort of complete the economic integration of the world, bears this out a bit, because the early power of the World Trade Organization was predicated on network power dynamics that brought a lot of countries into it. Once they're in it, though, I think there's been a resistance on the part of many different blocks of countries to new agreements. And so I think that means that the trade is not being sought in the final analysis for the inherent benefits it brings. And that once countries have been part of it, they've actually resisted further moves at the level of deepening trade.
Do you think those countries then have enough leverage to maybe change the dynamic of the WTO in the future, or is that something that it is so power-based that...
The problem is that the way that the amendments have to go require a consensus of the parties. So the amendment process in the World Trade Organization is notoriously difficult to get things through. In retrospect, it's amazing that so many agreements actually did get through. And there's been some good accounts of how different countries and holdouts have been sort of jostled to get them into agreement. But I think at this point, if there's any large countries or blocks of countries that don't want a new agreement, either in the direction of reform or the direction of deepening the existing model, they can effectively block it. And I think that's what we've seen for 4 or 5 years now, stalemate in the World Trade Organization.
What about some of these cases of cultural globalization? Again, you mentioned the McWorld idea, and a lot of the anti-globalization protesters talk about this. How much do you believe in that as a phenomenon? Is it as there's obviously polemical people on both sides, but if just studying it in terms of network power, how do you kind of look at that idea of cultural globalization?
Right. So the idea of network power again is that using a coordinating standard to gain access to other people for the sake of some beneficial cooperation can create a situation in which the standard spreads, so to speak, and more people join up in a network using that standard. So I think that this idea has some explanatory value for thinking about McWorld, but maybe not as much as some of the people who've read the book have thought I was assuming.
Okay.
So I think, for example, the spread of the Western business suit as a model, for example, of dress in business conferences, in fancy hotels, it's almost universal now. And it's very hard for me not to think of that as a form of complex signaling. I'm part of the in-group, I understand the rules of international business, and as for that reason being in some ways a product of network power. But other forms of cultural globalization, say the rise of pop music or various kinds of cultural fads, are harder for me to see in a network power lens. There may very well be network power dynamics at work, but I thought about them and couldn't come to a confident conclusion that they were there. I mean, here's why. If a teenager at one period in his life wants to listen to a certain kind of music to be cool like others, there's certainly some kind of mimicry. There's an element of psychosocial recognition at play. But that's a little bit different from that music being a focal point. It may be that he wants forms of recognition, and it's a little bit like Grand Central. Where do I go to be cool? I have to go and listen to this CD. I hint at that, but I don't want to put that out there confidently. By contrast, I think things like the Western business suit, even down to the level of the design of corporate office parks, actually has spread globally, very much tied to the logic of a certain kind of signaling in elite business. And so that's clearly, I think, a network power dynamic.
It's interesting too, because with all of the, like I say, the controversy over globalization and things like that, have you found that there have been people that might misconstrue some of the things that you've written about, because you are doing it in a certain, academic, studied way, a very measured way, and because it's such a hot topic, surely there must be people in terms of the reaction to the book that perhaps want to see what they want to see in what you're writing?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I was lucky that the first sort of big review of it came in a column in the Financial Times, and it was a very careful and positive review. Although the reviewer outed me as anti-capitalist, as he called me, and so on. And so I think he saw some of the more leftist and critical aspects of the book as prominent. I think that those are there, but I wouldn't want the idea of network power to devolve simply into another form of ammunition for anti-globalization critique, because I think it's both. It has that and can lend itself to that, but also has more than that. So,
okay.
Yeah.
It's interesting because in the book you talk about two forms of power that are key to understanding globalization. The first is sovereignty, and the second is sociability. I was wondering if you could give us a bit of a definition of both.
Right. So in studies of imperial history, there's often a distinction made between formal and informal empires, where formal empire involves the command or the control of one society by another, and the model of power at work is that of command, the authoritarian power of command. There's also been a lot of interest in what's been called informal empire. Hegemony, for example, is a form of informal empire. But the dynamics of power in informal empire are actually much harder to diagnose. And that's one of the reasons why I was interested in writing Network Power, was to try and give an analytic account of the kind of power that I think undergirds informal empire. Now, in the case of the authoritarian power of command, that can result in, at the national level, sovereignty, relations of sovereignty, where you have the command of some citizens by others. Say in a democratic vote, you have a majority deciding an outcome that holds good for everybody. Now, in an informal empire or in a circumstance of network power, even not between societies but within a society, because network power can also be operative at the domestic level, I think what you see is a form of voluntarism in which there's a person by person or group by group decision to join up with a dominant network on the terms already settled by it. And I think that choice scenario can be understood as a form of power. It's not a form of power as the power of command and sovereignty, but it is a kind of power in work in what I call the relations of sociability. The idea of sociability is a term that was used a lot by early modern writers. People like Thomas Hobbes were interested in the distinction between sociability and sovereignty. And the idea of sovereignty, of course, has continued on, but the idea of sociability has somewhat fallen away over the last 2 centuries. By sociability it was meant the manners, commerce, ideas, the private life of people outside the public power of the state. It's been a temptation for a long time to think of sociability as being a domain free of power, and that all the problem is with public determination. So sovereignty has power, sociability is just a realm of voluntarism in private life and isn't infected by relations of power. And one of the things I want to do in this book philosophically is to begin to challenge that and to give an account of how power can work in areas that may not be considered political, but which can be enormously consequential for our lives, nevertheless.
Maybe my final question is, in the final analysis, you say that really our task is to find kind of a global modernity that we can live with. And you also say that that's largely a task for politics, especially domestic politics. For citizens out there that perhaps are not on one side or the other, but for most people that are somewhere in the middle, what do you say to people in terms of how they should educate themselves about these ideas of network power and what they can do as citizens to try to put pressure on their leaders and things like this to have a positive outcome in our democracies? Well,
I mean, when I was writing the book and hoping for an Obama victory, but not hoping too dearly because of my fears, I think the idea that citizen engagement at the domestic level could transform international politics was more of an outside hope. I think that now lots and lots of people, at least in our generation, have a sense of how community organizing and grassroots politics can actually produce changes at the national level. And once you have an entire state under the control of people who want to do things a different way, things will happen at the global level. I think things like Kyoto, things like trade reform, environmental protections of various kinds all seem much more plausible at the international level than 2 years ago, say. And I think at least, even if nothing happens in the way that we hope it would, lots of people have had the lesson that domestic democratic action can have an impact, can have a real impact. And once you have the control of large states, you can actually change the global order. Now, whether that ends up happening in this case, I don't know, but that's the sort of thing that I was thinking about when I was saying that ultimately how we create a globalization that we can live with and live in will be dependent on how we can manage our politics at home.
All right, very good. Well,
thank you very much.
Here.
It was a pleasure.
Okay, same here. And thanks for being with us. We'll see you again soon.